We're trying to celebrate the achievements of 50 years of alumni, but also use the forum as an opportunity to speculate on the next 50 years for the faculty and for our discipline, which is architecture. For tonight's panel, we've chosen graduates from each decade of the last 50 years of graduates of the school, and we've deliberately chosen graduates who have gone out from UWA and made their name, their reputation in the four corners of the world. So part of our interest from the beginning and continued interest is for our graduates to be trained and able to work in the globalised world. It was very far-sighted of the founders of the faculty to, at its inception, foster a very outward-looking view of architecture, and I think the proof of that vision has been the fact that many of our graduates, including the 7 tonight, have gone out from UWA and made major contributions to architecture around the world. Well, increasingly Asia is the economic driver of the world, so UWA being in the time zone of most of Asia is, I think, well positioned to be part of, in fact, the Asian century. Although that said, our graduates have worked in all corners of the world, and indeed one of them tonight, Ross Donaldson, who heads a practice which has offices in Europe, in North America, in Asia and throughout Australia, and indeed the Middle East also. So while Asia is fundamental for, I think, the next generation, throughout our history our graduates have gone to the parts of the world where there has been opportunity, and variously that's been in North America, Europe, but now very much Asia. That said, also one of our earliest graduates, Kerry Hill, actually pioneered the move to Asia when moving there in 1971 as a young graduate from UWA, and then has managed to build a 5-decade career based in Asia but doing work all over the world. As we all know, climate change is one of the pressing issues of the next generation or two. I think the reason why architects are well positioned to lead the response to climate change is that architecture education has always included within it, over the last 50 years, a deep understanding of the way buildings and environments actually can alter the microclimates to in fact deliver human comfort. So many of the skills and abilities that architects possess are ideally suited to be able to mitigate climate, but also mitigate climate change. So one would hope that in an era where solutions to climate change problems will be needed, architects are rather uniquely positioned to be able to provide the innovation required to, in fact, deliver livable and comfortable human environments by using their skills in modifications of any adverse climate effects or otherwise to mitigate them and deliver the, one would hope, low energy, sustainable future we all aspire to. When the Vice-Chancellor wrote to the Foundation Dean Gordon Stevenson in 1959 asking to establish a Faculty of Fine Arts and Architecture, he also at that time had Stevenson, the university's consultant architect. So between 59 and 1965, when the first meeting of the faculty occurred, Stevenson had actually, in his master plans for the university, pencilled in a fine arts and architecture precinct and group of buildings exactly on the site of the Octagon Theatre. So in some respects, the Octagon was the place Prescott, the Vice-Chancellor, and Stevenson imagined the university would found its School of Architecture. So I think we have in some sense, a spiritual connection to that particular site. The Octagon Theatre was in fact one of the few parts of the Stevenson Fine Arts and Architecture Precinct vision that was in fact built. And Peter Parkes, architect, was one of the sessional staff in this faculty who, over 50 years, contributed to the teaching of the faculty. So again, for that reason, we think the Octagon Theatre is an appropriate venue, given that sessional staff like Peter, professional staff of great expertise like Peter, have provided half of our curriculum over the last 50 years. Again, part of Stevenson's vision was always that eminent practitioners would contribute to the teaching of the faculty. And I think lastly, Peter unfortunately passed away in this month last year, and so I think again it's fitting that we could recognise Peter's 5 decades contribution by hosting this function in his finest theatre. Peter would be, I think, humbled but delighted that I think that the vision of Stevenson of architecture and fine arts being together in the beautiful grounds of the university was in fact in some sense realised, if only for one night. The other thing worth noting from Stevenson and Prescott's vision was that fine arts and architecture were in fact seen as inseparable, and Stevenson always saw architecture as one of the fine arts. And over the last 50 years, the faculty has actually added to its disciplinary offerings by commencing teaching in art history in 1986, and then in visual arts and landscape architecture in 1992, and lastly in urban design in 2002. So in many respects, although we don't occupy the intended home of the faculty as imagined and planned by Prescott and Stevenson, we have in fact developed, I think, a curriculum and a group of staff, both permanent and sessional, who are committed to the vision of an architecture and fine arts faculty at UWA. And I think tonight's guests and the audience show that UWA architecture graduates are able to practice and make a contribution anywhere in the world. And that's always been the case. Kerry is not alone in being, of those first graduates, a young architect able to practice in the far corners of the world with great distinction and great success. And we would hope that in the future, we fully intend in the future, that all of our graduates will be able to go out from UWA and possibly come back, as many of our panellists often do, many of our graduates often do, but to be able to go out and make a contribution wherever they find themselves in the world.
Well, I think there'll be a celebration of UWA and the people that have been there. It's a great university and it's been a great architecture program. It was great for me, and the people I'll be sitting on a panel with tonight are some shining stars, both in Australian architecture and internationally. And I think it's a testament to the program here that we have such strength in the alumni. Perth architects globally have made an enormous impact, I think. And we can see from people like Kerry Hill and Richard Hassel and others that Perth, even with its remoteness, its legendary remoteness, actually gives you an incredible breeding for working internationally. And there is a kind of both global and local quality to being a person from Perth. I felt that myself, having left here some time ago, but always feeling that Perth has a strong identity and, you know, excellence, I think. And I think it'll be great to see some of the speakers exchange and debate ideas. And that's really at the heart of a university, and the architecture program is about exchanging ideas and looking for excellence. Well, it's never been a harder time in some ways to be an architect. There's an enormous culture of risk, and I think the people who have practiced for some decades, had an enormous head start in some ways, and I think a lot of young practitioners have a very difficult but exciting time in front of them. The world has changed enormously and continues to change, but architecture, if it's smart, can position itself in a useful position to help with change and to stress the importance of design in our cities. So for young architects, despite the many challenges, and I think it is harder now, there are great opportunities there. I think we've seen that in Western Australia in the last few years, where an architectural scene has been reborn essentially. And I have published projects, many exciting projects from Perth and WA, and it's great to see that happening, particularly amongst the people I studied with here. Well, sustainability generally and climate change specifically offers enormous opportunities for the built environment industry and for architecture as part of that. Good architects have always worked on a low energy basis, and we've seen that in all kinds of different ways. Passive solar design, the smart use of the sun, the smart use of building materials, and now with enormous development in material technology and building systems, architects are in a great position to be leaders in sustainability. And I think in the last 10 years we've seen sustainability go from a fringe activity to now a core part of most projects. It's very rare to do a project now that doesn't have a sustainability agenda. And to a large degree, architects have responded very well to that. They recognise the ethical importance of sustainability in producing good, sustainable buildings, and ultimately places that people, the users, which are all important, of projects and cities can enjoy. So the social sustainability aspects are also critical, as well as the energy sustainability and environmental sustainability. So we're in a good place to help with that sustainability discussion and that change. Well, I'll be doing my best impersonation of Tony Jones, who is the master at these things. I'll be trying to stimulate a conversation around some of these key issues like sustainability and globalisation, around the nature of Perth itself. So I'm anticipating a warm, energetic and maybe lively conversation that will draw on the enormous knowledge. My job will just be a sort of facilitator and really position these great panellists, all UWA alumni, together. And it's a great mix. We've got diversity of age and type of architect, so it'll be great to see how all these people come together. I think it's never been more important to think about design, particularly in relation to cities and buildings and infrastructure. As cities have become denser, including in Australia, design and architecture become more important, not less important. Design really is suited to the idea of a denser city and a smarter city. So I think there's no way in which architecture will ever be eliminated as a profession, and if it does it right and it does it in a smart way, and I think importantly architects act collegiately, then in fact I think architecture has a very promising future. Not forgetting there are some enormous challenges. We live in quite a conservative procurement society in Australia. Young architects don't have maybe the opportunities they used to, but there's still a lot of stuff to design, and if architects are smart enough, they can be part of that discussion. Well, regional discussions are always interesting, and it's great that a couple of our panellists tonight are regional practitioners outside of Perth as well as now in Perth as well. So when you work in a place as an architect, you want to work out the nature of that place and whether that's one of the places in Australia or overseas. And I think being able to work locally but in a sort of globally connected world is really the trick to architecture. Architecture and society generally has gone through waves of internationalism and then reaction to that. And I think architecture needs to have a foot in both of those camps. And good architecture is both of those things. So I think Perth is a good breeding ground for all of us really in relation to the more globalised world. But Perth is a region and it's a fantastic place. And I think in the last few years we've seen some of the opportunities that's created. But you know, it's also worth reminding us that architecture has in the past got a very bad name for some of the overstatements of its role, and I think we'll hopefully not make that mistake again. Well, our job on radio was really to try and bridge the gap between architects and the wider community. We found as practitioners in Melbourne that a lot of members of the general public were slightly removed from our profession, and we wanted to try and bridge that gap. And that really involved communicating architectural ideas that often aren't that complicated in simple, clear ways to try and really take apart some of the elitism of the profession. The profession has suffered from elitism in the past. And to try and, you know, make design important at an everyday level. Architecture is for everyone. And it's about understanding people's needs and bringing your expertise to it when it's needed. So the radio show was about that gap. It was also about telling some of the stories of architecture and what we do as a profession, who does it well, who does it badly, what we get to learn collectively, and also just sort of a little bit of really putting design as a key aspect of discussion. In the way music and film is an active part of Australian cultural discussion, architecture should be the same, and all people should have an opinion on it.
Oh, I think it's kind of an interesting time because we're kind of leaving a major paradigm that one might loosely call modernism, late modernism, and moving into something that's quite different. I think thinking about what's going to happen in the next 50 years is an interesting thing to do, because 50 years is quite a long time now, because a lot happens in a shorter space of time these days. So to imagine where we might be in 50 years is quite a big leap. There's many possible futures that I think we're in the middle of working out right now, in this transitional phase. I think we've got basically a lot of technological change which has shifted the way we operate, and that is, I think, increasingly going to be navigated towards sustainability issues and how we can better deal with the planet and the world. But I think there's a whole lot of other social changes and political changes and cultural changes that are all working together to set up some quite unique problems. Well, I think the fragility of capitalism, or late capitalism, is one big one. The global financial crisis was a bit of a shock, and I think that's really put everyone's belief in the system that is currently holding most activities together under question, and people don't believe in that so much. I think politics has also become fraught. It's not operating in the same way that it used to, and people don't believe in that political system as much as they used to. So some of those major kind of frameworks are looking a little shaky and a little fragile, and they have big impacts on, of course, what architects do in the end, alongside of all of the, what's happening with media and digital technologies and the impetus to reduce our carbon outputs. I studied at UWA. I finished my architecture degree right in the middle of a recession, quite a big recession, and not a single one of us got a job out of my year. So about 6 of us started a little practice in Northbridge in Perth, and we sort of set that up as a sort of an art architecture collaborative thing with a gallery, and we all did all sorts of different things, including radio shows and a few small jobs, because there wasn't obviously much work around. That's why none of us got a job. But that kind of led to further study, and in fine arts, actually I went back and did fine arts, and eventually, and then worked in some offices, but then went to Melbourne and got a job, firstly in a big office and then at RMIT teaching. So since about 97 I've been at RMIT and teaching and doing a PhD, and now I largely look after PhD candidates, and they're mostly doing research by creative practice. So we're looking at practice most of the time and thinking about that. I actually think it was a blessing in disguise that I didn't get a job when I finished, because I just ended up interacting with so many different people as a result of that, and doing other things, as well as obviously entering more into, art and theory and a sort of broader cultural kind of set of issues, I guess, I was thinking about as a result of that. I mean, it was a bit of a blow not getting a job. I think we all sat around and wondered what on earth, how this could possibly be happening. But it also meant that we all worked together as a set of graduates in a way that we wouldn't have otherwise. We would have all gone off into different places, and so that also fostered this sense of community in a way. Coming out and all of us not having a job meant we had to really work together. Well, we didn't have to, but we chose to, and that was a really, I think it was a really productive thing. It was a productive experience for us, to really have to, I guess, work off our own resources rather than find ourselves in an existing structure that we then worked as you sort of become an apprentice when you go into an office, I guess, in some ways. We had to sort of swim in the deep end straight away. And so I think we learnt a lot, but we also just learnt about the value of working together in our own ways, very own ways.
Well, I think there's a few strands or pressures pushing architecture in different directions. So one, we got massive urbanisation. So I think dealing with super high density in cities is something coming up. Then of course, I think sustainability's been a buzzword for a while, but in terms of the way it's implemented and testing out various ideas, I think there's lots of different research going on there, and design research. So for us particularly, we've been looking at that, how to shrink cities' footprints to the size of the city itself, for instance. Then I think we've got immigration happening everywhere, so we've got actually big cultural shifts and cultural mixing where you get a lot of immigrants from one culture coming into another. So I think all those things together are some interesting drivers for architectural responses. I think Singapore is actually a really interesting place because it's somewhere which has just got limited space. So in terms of the issues of density and development, Singapore sort of ran out of land. The minute it became a nation 50 years ago, and so a lot of issues, I think, come to a head there first. So Singapore's, got problems with water, with food, with energy, and with housing a growing population in a limited space. So I think our work in Singapore we're doing there, we're finding a lot of other countries then are very interested to see these solutions and see how they might apply them in their own environment. We get quite a few students from UWA coming to work in our office, and particularly because I studied at UWA. But I think, Australia generally, I think, has got a very aware population about issues to do with sustainability and those sort of changing forces in the world. And I think Australia particularly has a kind of nuts and bolts kind of attitude towards doing things. So actually knowing, a lot of people I think know how to make stuff and put stuff together, and that's really good. And WA itself, I think, being on the western side of Australia and close to Asia and with an Indian Ocean focus, is something that makes students particularly suitable for working around the Asian region, and that's one of the most rapidly developing regions in the world for the next century. Yeah, I think the only disadvantage maybe is in a way, in terms of the experience and skill set, is that Perth is a very low density city and doesn't have those kind of pressures. So I think that's something though that the school addresses through exchange programs, trips overseas, and working on projects in Asia. Each country, we work in many countries around Asia and Australia and India, China, and each place has its own particular set of things they're good at and things that they're terrible at. So it's really important that the design takes that into account, or else you risk something that looked great on paper looking pretty bad when it's actually built. And it can be very frustrating. For instance, in India, they seem to only certain areas have skills, and some big towns like Mumbai, you just find that although labour should be cheap and plentiful, they actually highly they're expensive, and everyone seems to be particularly bad at their job. So working in Australia as we are now and getting to meet some super professional builders or artisans is fantastic, to find people who are committed to a craft and a construction industry and can really contribute that to make a building fantastic.
I graduated in '68. We were the very first graduates, 8 of us at that time. And I worked in Perth until 1971 with Geoffrey Harlett. Then I went to live in Asia, and I've lived there ever since. I think that architecture is morphing into a bit of a blur throughout the world. A bit later I'll talk briefly about what Michael Brand, the director of the Art Gallery of New South Wales, calls plonk architecture. What that means is a Zaha here and a Geary there, and sort of architecture at home everywhere and nowhere. And for that reason, there are very few architects who come to Asia and actually engage with the traditions of the place. Young Asian architects do, particularly Chinese and others. Yeah. And also don't forget Asia, even though Australia likes to think it's a very close neighbour, it's a place that, as Paul Keating said, Australians flew over on their way to Paris. And he's right. It's only since probably the mid-70s, early 80s, that Australians have really taken an interest in Asia. Well, UWA, I think, is a very good school, and it has graduates working all over the globe. I've always employed 1, 2 or 3 UWA graduates, either in our Perth office or in Singapore. In fact, Richard Hassel, who's one of the others, came to work with me straight from university. He was introduced by his auntie, who lived in Singapore, and she approached my wife across the bridge table and said, I've got a nephew who's graduating. can Kerry give him a job? So I rang Geoffrey London, who was the head of the school, and said, what's he like? And he said, well, he doesn't know it yet, but he's the top of the class. So I grabbed him, and he only came for about a year. Initially, he was on his way to Spain to become an artist. And he ended up staying with me for 6 years and then formed a practice, and now he's one of the most successful architects working. What I've discovered many times over is that the young architects or designers who are ambidextrous and who draw at the same time as they're using their mouse, literally, are the best designers, because they still think from their brain to their hand, and that's how architects have always communicated. So the art of drawing, I think, is essential. You know, I think the world has entered what I call an age of uncertainty, whether it's socioeconomic, geopolitical, racial, and you know, that's uncomfortable. But it's also been said that we become our most creative in the face of uncertainty. It opens multiple interpretations that often don't exist. And so perhaps we're about to enter a phase of what would I say, intense, you know, sort of architectural exploration. And also, of course, technology is developing pretty rapidly, but I like to think of it as developing to enhance the core values of architecture that have always existed. I think one example of this is a competition we've just lost, the Sydney Modern in New South Wales, which was a major competition and a fantastic one to be involved in. While we were doing the competition, we met a professor from Cambridge, Dr. David Ball, who has finished developing a cement-free concrete, which is now in production in Cambridge, and he expects it to be in production in Australia in about 3 years. Our engineer did a calculation on our building in the competition, which we designed as a concrete building. And if we use cement-free concrete, it reduced the carbon footprint by 90%, which was equivalent to taking 5,000 cars off the road for 1 year in Sydney. Now, I think that kind of technological development is fantastic. And that's the sort of thing that's happening now.